I caught my wife cheating on the day I was going to reveal my terminal diagnosis. Now I'm choosing how to live my final days, on my terms, not hers. I never imagined I'd be sharing my story with strangers on the internet, but here I am, a throwaway account for reasons that will soon become obvious. My situation doesn't allow me to fully confide in those closest to me, and I need an outlet to process everything. On the 1st of December, I received the news I'd been dreading. All of the tests confirmed the diagnosis: stage 4 pancreatic cancer. It was terminal. This will be my last holiday season, and I've come to terms with that. I've had a life well lived, and I'm at peace with what's coming. My loved ones will be taken care of, financially, emotionally, and otherwise. That's all I can ask for. I am, by nature, a private man, so my wife, Jane, knew nothing about the tests or my condition. I didn't want to worry her until I had answers. I decided to leave work early that day, planning to go home and tell her everything face to face. This was not a conversation I could have over the phone or in a text, but my life changed more than once that afternoon. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed the car of one of my business partners parked outside. It's unmistakable, flashy, expensive, and adorned with a personalized license plate. Seeing it there sent a ripple of confusion through me. It wasn't just out of the ordinary, it was downright bizarre. I pulled up our home camera system on my phone, more out of habit than suspicion, only to see it was in privacy mode. That meant the cameras weren't recording. I didn't like it, but I brushed it off, convincing myself there must be a reasonable explanation. Rather than going inside, I turned the truck around and drove to my farm property. I'd go home later. The farm has always been my sanctuary, a place to think, to escape, and to breathe. Years ago, I configured a second server to archive the camera footage for safety, but mostly because I enjoy watching wildlife wander the property and storms roll in. Sitting at my desk, I opened the archives on my computer, half expecting to find nothing, but my gut told me differently. And I was right. There they were, Jane and my business partner in our living room, laughing, drinking wine, dancing. Then I watched as they made their way upstairs to the master suite. The bedroom doors were open just enough for the microphones to pick up the sounds I didn't need to hear to understand what was happening. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, feeling nothing and everything all at once. My hands trembled, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the footage. The woman I'd shared over 2 decades of my life with, the one I'd loved unconditionally, had betrayed me. And now, with my limited time left, this is the reality I'm left to face. Call me what you will, but all of my love and devotion for her died that afternoon. I didn't rage. I didn't scream. I simply felt hollow. I had so little time left, and I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't waste a single moment of it on anger or drama. I needed answers, but I refused to allow this betrayal to tarnish the little time I had remaining. The first thing I did was call my lawyer. We reviewed my will and the prenuptial agreement Jane and I had signed years ago. I told him everything. Together, we began to dig deeper into the affair. When it started, how long it had been going on, and to what extent Jane's actions had infiltrated my life. What we found was worse than I could have imagined. Either I never really knew the woman I married, or something in her had broken long before now. At this point, I have no intention of telling anyone, not yet. I won't let this ruin the holidays. My children, their spouses, and my grandchildren deserve one final, beautiful Christmas with me. They don't need this storm cloud hanging over us, nor do I want to cast a shadow over their memories. Jane will be there, of course. She'll be just another detail in the background, a quiet piece of scenery in the family gathering I'm determined to make special. She doesn't deserve my attention, and, frankly, I don't care about her presence. Some context for those wondering. Jane and I never had children together. My twins, a son and daughter, are from a relationship long before Jane came into my life. Their mother, Sarah, made the right choice not to marry me when we were young, and I don't blame her. It wasn't until the twins were 3 that I truly stepped up and became the father I wanted to be. Sarah later married a man named Steve, a good man, a better stepfather, and someone I would call a friend. Together, we co-parented well, and over the years, our family dynamic became something close to perfect. Jane, for her part, has always been financially independent. Before we met, she had a great career and a generous trust from her family. Early in our marriage, she insisted on a prenup. Her assets remained hers, mine remained mine. I didn't mind. I've always lived modestly. She has no idea how much I'm worth, only that I've always provided for her completely. The house, utilities, travel, food, everything, I covered it all. Her income and wealth were spent on herself. Cars, clothes, personal trips, and the cosmetic surgery she took such pride in. On the outside, she's beautiful, but now I see how ugly she is on the inside. A few days after I got my diagnosis, I announced my retirement from the nonprofit I've been involved with for decades. Jane's reaction to that announcement didn't sit right with me. It was subtle, but there, a flicker of discomfort, maybe even panic. I imagine she realized I'd be around more often now. Tomorrow is my last day at work. From here on out, my focus will be on my family, on giving them the final memories they deserve. I've given my lawyer access to the archive footage and left him to handle the details of Jane's affair. I don't check anymore. I don't need to. What I know is enough. The days ahead will be busy. The kids and grandkids will arrive at the farm soon. There, we'll decorate the tree, cook, laugh, and celebrate together, just like we do every year. I'll be the doting father and grandfather, playing the role of loving husband where needed. It'll be hard, but this is what matters. When the time comes, after the new year, Jane will know everything. The betrayal, the consequences, all of it. She'll have her reckoning, and while I won't be there to see it, I'll know I left my family and my legacy intact. Until then, I'll hold on to what truly matters, my family, the farm, and the fleeting time I have left. I'm at peace with what's to come. This story isn't over yet. The holidays passed as perfectly as they could, a bittersweet blend of joy and the quiet weight of unspoken truths. The farm buzzed with life for that precious week, filled with the laughter of grandchildren, the warmth of family traditions, and the smell of pine and wood smoke hanging in the air. It was everything I had hoped for, one final celebration to anchor the memories my family would hold on to long after I was gone. Jane was present through it all, but her presence was like a shadow. The weight of what I knew made her movements stand out. The sudden need for air, the quick departures to run errands. The phone she guarded as if it held her very life. Her actions, once innocuous, now made perfect sense. I could see the guilt in her eyes when she thought no one was looking, though it was well hidden behind the polished mask she wore for the family. As the cars disappeared down the gravel driveway at the end of the week, a silence settled over the house, more profound than any I had felt before. The echoes of goodbyes and the distant sound of tires on frozen earth slowly gave way to the stillness of an empty home. It felt like the world itself had sighed, marking the end of something I could never recreate. Jane returned to her routines quickly, her habits as predictable as ever. What she hadn't realized was that everything around her was already in motion. The plans I had set with my lawyer were progressing with ruthless efficiency. My will was finalized, my instructions to the trust were clear, and the divorce papers sat neatly in a folder, ready to be served when the time came. The house no longer felt like a shared home, but rather a stage where I silently observed her rehearsed performances. The week that followed allowed me to settle unfinished business. The trust had been transitioned, its future placed in the capable hands of my children and grandchildren. Each of them had signed their part, unaware at first of the deeper reasons for this meeting. When the truth of my illness came to light, the room erupted in grief and resistance. My daughter left the table several times, unable to process the reality of what I'd told them, while Sarah and Steve worked to keep everyone grounded. Through it all, I remained calm, explaining my decision to let nature take its course and reminding them of the gift we'd just shared. One final Christmas unmarred by the weight of my diagnosis. Their anger and sadness were expected, and I let them feel it fully, knowing it was a necessary part of their own closure. When the questions began to slow and the reality started to settle, I revealed the final truth about Jane. The betrayal hit them with a fury I hadn't anticipated. My daughter's grief turned to anger, and the fragments of Jane's behavior over the holidays suddenly clicked into place for everyone. Her mysterious absences, her guarded demeanor, the moments she disappeared when others were around. All of it made sense now. I assured them that I'd handled everything quietly, that Jane's actions would not impact their lives or the legacy I was leaving behind. When the meeting ended, there was a collective heaviness in the room. For the first time in a long while, I felt lighter. My family knew the truth, and I had given them a future I could be proud of. Jane had no place in it, and that knowledge gave me peace. The following morning, I sat in the quiet kitchen, the folder containing the divorce papers on the table in front of me. Jane came downstairs, dressed as if she had somewhere important to be, her polished exterior as pristine as ever. Without needing words, I laid everything out in front of her. The evidence, the consequences, and the end of our marriage were all there, undeniable and irreversible. The weight of what I had known for weeks finally fell on her shoulders, leaving her visibly shaken. It was clear, as she sat there frozen, that she had never expected this day to come. Whatever regret or sadness she felt was irrelevant now. The choices she made had led her here, and there was no undoing them. She signed the papers quietly, the realization settling in that her life, as she knew it, had shattered. When Jane walked out the door that morning, I watched her go, the finality of her departure settling over me like a closing chapter. There was no satisfaction in seeing her leave, no vindication, only a sense of calm. I had given her the freedom to live with the consequences of her actions. That was punishment enough. The house, now truly empty, felt like mine again for the first time in years. I spent my days at the farm, surrounded by the land I loved, the memories I created, and the legacy I would leave behind. My family visited often, their time with me now precious in ways none of us had ever imagined before. I held my grandchildren close, laughed with my son under the stars, and listened as my daughter shared her dreams and worries for the future. The decline came gradually at first, a little less energy, a little more pain, but I accepted it with the same calm I'd embraced since the beginning. I had done everything I set out to do. My family was secure, the truth was known, and my final days were spent on my terms. When the end came, it was quiet. I fell asleep one evening in my father's old armchair, the fire crackling softly beside me, and I never woke up. The house was still, the farm blanketed in the silence of a winter night. Jane's reckoning would come later, after I was gone. She would find herself alone, stripped of the life she had so callously betrayed, forced to face the reality of what she'd lost. That was no longer my concern. For me, there was peace in the end. I had lived a life of integrity, loved my family well, and left behind a legacy I could be proud of. And that, in the end, was enough. But I still want this space for myself. The emotions were incredibly raw, and we had been talking off and on as a group for hours. I told them I needed to step back and focus on the trust for now. They understood its importance and how critical it would be in keeping Jane away from my hard-earned wealth. I emphasized how the trust would protect them, and that was the reason Jane was not part of this meeting. Her betrayal had no place in this family discussion. As I moved on to share the trust financials, I saw a shift in the room. I think they had always assumed the trust was a simple mechanism, a tax dodge, maybe, or just a way to keep my assets safe in a marriage where the kids were from a previous relationship. They weren't ready for what I showed them. As I laid out the balance sheets and went through the assets, the silence became profound. Then came the inevitable question. Why did you work so hard for so long when you already had this much? It was a fair question, one they had likely pondered for years. I explained my philosophy about personal finance, lessons they had heard before, but this time with more weight. I told them that the trust had given me freedom. I lived off it all these years. It sent them to college. It allowed me to prioritize time with them, to take care of their needs while still giving me the ability to work for a nonprofit, practically for free. The trust wasn't just money. It was a legacy, a tool that gave me a life with purpose. If there's anything I want this trust to teach you, I said, it's that wealth can do more than write checks to charity. It can empower you to build something real, to work for causes that matter, to make a difference. I had spent years training others, building relationships, and pushing forward initiatives that I believed in. I didn't want them to think money alone was enough. It's what you do with it that matters. The trust, I explained, wasn't just a safety net, it was a foundation for something greater. By the time I finished, I could see how deeply the conversation had impacted them. I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. I knew their lives had changed in that moment, for the better, but also in ways I hadn't intended. It wasn't the way I wanted this to happen, but it was done. They knew the truth, and now they had a responsibility to carry it forward. Before we ended the meeting, I begged them for one thing, to let me deal with Jane. I made it clear that nothing about the trust or what we discussed could be shared with anyone, especially Jane. We would maintain the status quo until I became too sick to keep up appearances. They agreed, though I knew it was hard for them to hold back their anger. We spent the rest of the day together. We cooked a meal, sat around the table, talking, crying, laughing, and breaking into smaller groups for quiet moments. There was so much to process, not just about the trust, but about my condition and what lay ahead. My daughter and son left for the evening with their families, though I expected them to return later. They needed time to process this on their own, to share with their spouses, and I understood that. I love my in-laws as much as my own children, and I trusted them to handle this information with care. That night, the quiet of the farm felt heavier than usual. For years, it had been a place of refuge, my sanctuary from the chaos of life. Now it was something else, a space to prepare for what was coming. I sat by the fire, listening to the crackle of the logs as I stared into the flames. A weight had lifted after sharing the truth, but it was replaced by a new burden, the worry of what would happen once I was gone. I knew my children would honor the trust and care for each other, but letting go was still hard. The following day brought an unexpected visit. Carol, one of Jane's oldest friends, showed up at the farm unannounced. Carol was around Jane's age, and I had known her for decades. In fact, I introduced the two of them years ago. Her visit surprised me, though not as much as what she had to say. Carol had hosted the most recent girls' night, the same night Jane had come home stumbling drunk and used a rideshare. Apparently, Jane had reached a breaking point that evening. Intoxicated and unraveling, she confided in Carol about her affair. According to Carol, Jane kept rambling, spilling details long after Carol told her to stop. Carol's anger had been palpable even the next morning when she reached out to Jane, demanding an explanation. Jane, of course, denied everything. She claimed Carol was mistaken, that she'd made it all up. Carol wasn't buying it. Furious, she told Jane she had a week to come clean to me, or she would tell me herself. When Carol arrived at the farm, she expected to find me devastated. Instead, I calmly invited her inside, offered her coffee, and told her I already knew. Her surprise was evident, but I assured her I had discovered the affair weeks ago. I asked if anyone else had been present for Jane's confession. Carol said no, it had been just the two of them. She also promised she hadn't told anyone else yet. I thanked her for coming to me, but I explained that I had my own timeline for dealing with Jane. Adding more people to the mix would only complicate my plans. I asked her to let Jane believe she had convinced Carol she was mistaken. Carol hesitated, saying it didn't sit right with her, but I asked her to try for my sake. She reluctantly agreed, though I knew she wouldn't stay quiet for long. After Carol left, I finalized my plans. Jane and I had a weekly date night at a quiet, familiar restaurant. It was where I decided to confront her. I had already told my lawyer and Carol about the plan. Carol would be on standby to help Jane after I left. My lawyer and his wife would also be dining at the same restaurant. Far enough away not to intrude, but close enough to witness the interaction if necessary. I had everything ready: the evidence, the divorce papers, and a letter detailing my wishes for her to stay away from me and the family. That night, the restaurant was dimly lit and peaceful, as it always was. Jane seemed oblivious to what was coming. She smiled across the table, reminiscing about our relationship and all the years we'd spent together. Her words were full of sentimentality and false warmth, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness for what could have been. As we reached the end of the meal, I asked her calmly if she thought I treated her well, if I had ever been unkind or inattentive. She answered without hesitation, assuring me I had been nothing but a good husband. I let her words hang in the air for a moment before I asked my final question. Why did she cheat on me? The color drained from her face. She stammered, denying everything, trying to claim Carol was mistaken. I stopped her with a simple statement. I already know. I've known for weeks. I laid out everything. The footage, the timeline, the truth she thought she'd hidden so well. Jane sat frozen, staring at me, unable to deny it any longer. I slid the briefcase across the table. Inside were the divorce papers and the evidence. I told her I knew about her betrayal and that it changed nothing for me. My time was limited, and I intended to spend the remainder of it in peace, without her in my life. I asked her not to contact me or my family again, and then I stood up, leaving her there in stunned silence. Walking out of that restaurant felt like closing the final chapter of a book I never wanted to read. The night air was cold, but I felt lighter, freer, as though a weight had finally been lifted. My plan wasn't perfect. Life rarely goes according to plan, but it was enough. I had done what I needed to do. The farm was quiet when I returned, the only sound the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. I sat by the fire once more, staring into the flames, letting the evening replay in my mind. It wasn't victory I felt. It was peace. A quiet, fragile peace that came from knowing I had done what was right, not for Jane, but for myself and for my family. Jane's reckoning had come, and though I wouldn't be around to see the full consequences unfold, I knew this. The life I had built, the values I held dear, and the love I shared with my family would endure long after I was gone. That, more than anything, was enough for me. The confrontation unfolded as planned, though nothing ever quite goes exactly as imagined. The night began like any other of our weekly date nights, a long-standing tradition Jane and I had shared for years. We frequented the same restaurant, so much so that we had a regular table tucked in the back. Public enough to avoid suspicion, private enough for what I needed to say. I had carefully orchestrated every detail. I arranged for my lawyer and his wife to dine at the same time, just a table or two away. Our longtime server, familiar with us, was informed beforehand and handed payment for both meals in advance. Carol was on standby, ready to support Jane when it was all said and done. The dinner started ordinarily, Jane playing the part of the perfect wife. She talked about us, reminiscing on our years together. I sat across from her, listening but already disconnected, waiting for the moment to drop the truth. As dessert was cleared away, I leaned in, my voice steady as I began. I explained how I'd rushed home after receiving my diagnosis, desperate to have one of the most difficult conversations of my life with the person I thought I could trust most. I described how I'd found his car in the driveway, seen the cameras switch to privacy mode, and how I had chosen to leave instead of facing what I already suspected. At this point, the confidence Jane wore like armor began to crack. Her expression shifted from composed to uneasy as she listened, the reality settling in. I told her that, yes, I had footage, archive recordings that left nothing to doubt. She nearly interrupted to ask how, but I raised my hand, cutting her off. I wasn't finished. Then came the truth that hit her hardest. I told her about my diagnosis, how I had decided not to fight the disease, to let nature take its course. I saw it, real heartbreak flicker in her eyes, as if she had any right to feel sorrow for me. And that angered me. How dare she grieve me when she was part of what broke me? But I pushed forward undeterred, signaling to our server. I brought over my lawyer, who handed me a briefcase and a folder containing a letter. I signed it in front of Jane and the server, who acted as a witness, and then handed it to her. The letter made everything clear. I didn't want her contacting me, my family, or stepping foot on the farm after this night. It was over. Next, I gave her the briefcase. I calmly explained that it contained evidence of her betrayal, along with signed divorce papers. All she had to do was sign and begin the proceedings. I made it clear, I didn't expect to survive a contested divorce. As long as I was alive, she could stay in the house in town, but I would be at the farm. I would not see her again. There were no excuses I would accept, no justifications I wanted to hear. Jane sat there, frozen, her pride shattered, her composure cracked. I told her Carol was waiting to take her home and that I was done. Quietly, she nodded, barely managing a word. In true Jane fashion, she kept herself together in public, but I knew the facade wouldn't hold once she was alone. On my way out, I stopped to tip the server generously and apologize to the restaurant owner for the scene, though he hadn't seemed to notice anything unusual. As I left, I spotted my son at the door. Carol passed me with a small, encouraging smile, concern clouding her expression as she moved inside to help Jane. My son drove me back to the farm, his wife alongside us for support. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in months. Relief swept over me, tempered only by the inevitable pang of loss. Loss for the life I thought I had, and for the trust one had once believed unshakable. The family arrived at the farm the following day, making sure I was okay. It felt a little like being coddled, but their presence warmed me nonetheless. Then Carol showed up in the afternoon. She wasted no time, sharing what she knew. Jane, predictably, had fallen apart that night. But by Saturday, she had reached out to him. Her AP, her supposed future. That's when reality hit her like a brick wall. She realized what I already knew. She was nothing more than a pawn to him. He had no love for her. He had simply used her to see if she could buy the loan I held against his business. What neither Jane nor her AP knew was that I had already sold the loan to the trust, and my daughter, the MBA in the family, had wasted no time calling for a forensic audit of his company. Jane's usefulness to him was gone, and he discarded her just as I expected he would. Carol made it clear that Jane had spiraled further upon learning the truth. Her trust was exhausted. Her pension would be her only lifeline. In her twisted mind, Jane had seen life with her AP as glamorous. Fancy cars, first-class flights, expensive dinners. In contrast, I was the man who lived humbly, drove a 15-year-old pickup truck, spent time on a farm, and insisted we fly economy. To her, he seemed wealthier. She had no idea the life she had walked away from. And then Carol surprised me. After recounting everything, she looked at me with a mixture of admiration and honesty. "You're no longer encumbered," she said. "If you need companionship, don't hesitate to call me." I stared at her, stunned, and challenged the idea. Why would any woman, knowing my diagnosis, choose to spend time with me when there could be no long-term future? Carol's response was both humbling and unexpected. Because Jane didn't know what she had. There are plenty of women who would cherish whatever time they could have with a man like you. I thanked her, but deep down, I knew I wasn't ready for complications. I had no interest in companionship, not now. The idea of inviting anyone else into my life felt exhausting. I had enough to focus on: my family, my legacy, and the little time I had left. Carol left me with a kiss on the cheek and a lingering thought. Perhaps, after everything I'd been through, there was still something in me worth cherishing. The farm was quiet again after she left, the stillness wrapping around me like a familiar blanket. I sat by the window, looking out over the land that had been my refuge for so many years. The weight of it all lingered, but it no longer consumed me. I had done what I needed to do. Jane's choices were hers to bear. Her reckoning had come, and though I wouldn't see the aftermath, I took solace in knowing my family would be spared her toxicity. I would spend the rest of my days with the people who mattered, honoring the life I had built and the legacy I would leave behind. For the first time in a long while, I felt peace. The past few weeks have been a whirlwind, an unrelenting cycle of revelations, resolutions, and the inevitable decline of my health. I've had moments of peace and quiet, but they've been fleeting. The news of my diagnosis and the collapse of my marriage is spreading through the social circles, and now I brace for the steady stream of well-wishers who'll come by to express sympathy or curiosity. Life is what it is. Time to roll with the punches. Physically, I'm still standing, though it's getting harder. The coughing has worsened, and I find myself winded after small tasks that wouldn't have fazed me before. But every day above ground is a blessing, and for now, I'll take it. Jane, for her part, has all but disappeared. Her status in the community, a pedestal she cherished for years, crashed hard and fast. Once word spread, she was politely asked to step down from her various leadership roles, her friends turning cold almost overnight. I've heard whispers that people in her social circle have outright confronted her, asking if she'd chased after their husbands too. She's tried to reach out to me, though mostly through proxies, begging for some form of closure. I've ignored every attempt. Why should I spend what little time I have left worrying about her needs? Her closure is not my problem. From what I've pieced together, her affair with the AP wasn't just a careless lapse in judgment. It was calculated, planned, and steeped in effort. They played games, role-playing as newlyweds or couples celebrating milestone anniversaries during their trips. She'd stored a second car in town to keep her movements hidden, swapping vehicles to avoid suspicion. She used my house because it was familiar, because it sat far enough back from the road to shield the driveway from wandering eyes. Her betrayal ran deeper than I could have imagined, and I feel no guilt for how I've handled it. If anything, her effort to deceive only solidifies that I made the right choice to cut her out of my life. As for the AP, his true motives have become painfully clear. He wasn't in it for Jane. He was using her to influence the loan I held over his business. Once I sold that loan to the family trust, the pressure on him became unbearable, and Jane quickly lost her value to him. When she went crawling back for comfort, she realized he'd been using her all along. Now, she's just as discarded as she tried to make me feel. Poetic in a way. Meanwhile, my daughter, the one with the MBA, has wasted no time calling for a forensic audit of his company. AP is livid, of course, but his threats of lawsuits are empty. His credit, reputation, and business dealings are shot to hell. Employees in his accounting department, perhaps seeing the writing on the wall, have started cooperating fully with my daughter. There's no criminal activity, but AP has been exploiting every perk and loophole for his own gain, driving the company's value into the ground. When the dust settles, his income will take a 60% hit. Knowing my daughter, she'll likely fire him outright or demote him into irrelevance. The flashy cars, the first-class flights, all of it is headed for a brick wall. I'll admit, the whole situation has brought me satisfaction. Not because I sought revenge, but because justice has a way of setting things right. Family and companionship. My family has been my saving grace. I've spent time at high school basketball games with the grandkids, hosted poker nights with my son, and sat around the table telling stories that make us laugh until we cry. These small, beautiful moments are what I live for now. Carol, too, has become a regular presence, one I didn't expect but don't entirely mind. She brings meals, keeps me company, and even stays a few nights a week. There's nothing physical between us, but her companionship has been comforting. Maybe she's wearing me down. I've resisted letting anyone in since my marriage crumbled, but Carol's persistence and warmth have started to chip away at my walls. A few days ago, everything shifted again. I don't remember much about what happened. I woke up in the hospital, surrounded by worried faces. I'd been found unconscious at the farm, my breathing shallow but still there. My do not resuscitate order didn't come into play, as I hadn't technically died. I hate hospitals with every fiber of my being, but even more so now. I don't want to die there. I want my final moments to be on the farm, watching the sunrise or sunset, surrounded by the land that has given me so much peace. During my stay, there was a moment of unwelcome interruption. I woke up one night to find Jane sitting beside me, holding my hand as though she were still my devoted wife. Somehow, she convinced an unsuspecting nurse to let her in. I pulled my hand away the moment I realized what was happening. Jane started in with her apologies again. She didn't mean it. She was trying to use AP. She still cared about me. I didn't engage. I just sat there, watching her spiral, unmoved by the performance. Her presence caught the attention of the night nurse, who swiftly intervened, asking her to leave under the pretense of needing to run checks. Once the room was quiet again, the nurse looked at me, concerned. I quietly explained that Jane was my ex-wife and that she wasn't supposed to be there. She called my emergency contacts, Sarah, my daughter, and Carol, and within 45 minutes, they were at my side. Jane left without much of a scene, though not before pressing an unwelcome kiss to my forehead. I recoiled, but let it slide for the sake of keeping the peace. That incident reminded me of who Jane truly is, someone drowning in her own mistakes, clawing at anyone nearby to keep herself afloat. I'm not special to her. I'm just another lifeline she thinks she can use. I won't be that for her. Not now, not ever. Final reflections. My days are simpler now. I spend them tending to the farm, albeit slowly, checking fences, watching the animals, and soaking in the quiet. Friends and family come by often, and though they call it a living wake, I see it as a chance to enjoy these final moments with the people who matter most. There's peace in knowing the farm, the trust, and the legacy I've built will carry on long after I'm gone. My family will be provided for, and my children have shown me they're capable of protecting what I've entrusted to them. That's all I could ask for. To all of you who've followed this journey, thank you. Your support, encouragement, and kind words have meant more to me than you'll ever know. I don't know how much time I have left, but I intend to spend it surrounded by the people who love me and by the land that has always felt like home. The pain and betrayal Jane brought into my life are behind me now. What remains is gratitude. Gratitude for the time I still have, for the love of my family, and for the peace I've found amidst it all. For now, the sun is setting on the farm, and I think I'll sit and watch it, just as I've always done.